This all happened during the worst year of my life. The kind of year people talk about later and say, I don't know how I survived that. At the time, though, survival wasn't a choice. It was just something my body kept doing while everything else collapsed. It started with my mom. She had been sick for a long time, but the last year was different. The disease didn't just take her health, it took our entire life. I moved into her place, or rather, I started living between hospitals, pharmacies, and her bedroom. My days were measured in pill schedules, doctor appointments, insurance phone calls, and sleepless nights listening to her breathe, terrified that one day she wouldn't. I stopped being a daughter. I became a caregiver. I learned how to change bandages, how to lift her without hurting her, how to smile and say I'm fine when people asked how I was holding up. I wasn't holding up. I was falling apart quietly. When she passed away, it wasn't dramatic. No movie moment. Just a phone call early in the morning and a silence so heavy it felt physical. After the funeral, everyone went back to their lives. I went back to an apartment that felt empty in a way I didn't know was possible. I barely had time to grieve. Because almost immediately after the funeral, my marriage ended even though I didn't know it yet. One night, while trying to distract myself, I borrowed my husband's laptop. A notification popped up. Just a name. A heart emoji. I didn't plan to look. I didn't want to look. But I did. And that was it. There was another woman. Not a mistake. Not a one-time thing. A whole parallel life. Messages full of inside jokes, plans, tenderness, all the things that had disappeared from our marriage while I was busy watching my mother die. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He just looked tired. Almost relieved. Like he had been waiting for me to find out so he wouldn't have to pretend anymore. The divorce was fast and brutal. Lawyers, paperwork, arguments about money, arguments about custody, arguments about who deserved what after years of shared life. I was grieving my mother and my marriage at the same time, and no one prepares you for that kind of double loss. I barely had time to breathe before the next blow hit. Work. I had been with the same bank for years, one of the biggest banks in the country. It was supposed to be stable. Safe. The kind of job you hold on to when everything else is uncertain. Then the emails started. Organizational changes. Process optimization. Automation. They didn't say layoffs at first. But that's what it was. Entire departments disappearing overnight. People packing their desks in silence, escorted out with cardboard boxes and forced smiles. When my manager called me into a meeting room, I already knew. She avoided my eyes. HR was on the call. My position was being eliminated. There were no comparable roles available. No transfers. No exceptions. Just like that, I was unemployed. No job. No husband. No mother. I had a child to take care of and a mortgage that didn't care about my grief. Every month, the payment came like a threat. Miss it, and everything else would fall apart too. So I took anything I could get. Freelance work. Temporary gigs. Night shifts. Weekend shifts. I cleaned, translated, babysat, helped strangers organize their paperwork, anything that paid something. I sent out resumes like it was my full-time job. Dozens of applications. Then hundreds. Most of them went unanswered. Some companies replied weeks later with polite rejection emails that all sounded the same. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. A few invited me to interviews, only to ghost me afterward. I remember one interview in particular. I dressed up, practiced answers, arranged childcare, and drove across town in the rain. The interviewer smiled, nodded, said I was a great fit. 2 days later, they froze hiring. Another time, I made it to the final round only to be told they chose someone younger, cheaper, more flexible. Meanwhile, bills piled up. I learned how to calculate groceries down to the cent. I stopped buying anything for myself. No clothes. No coffee. No small comforts. Everything went to survival. At night, after my child fell asleep, I would sit in the dark and stare at the wall, wondering how many more hits a person could take before something inside them just shut off. It felt like every time I tried to stand up, life knocked me back down again. And the worst part? There was no villain to fight. No clear enemy. Just loss, one after another, stacking up until I couldn't remember what it felt like to be okay. That year didn't break me, but it came very, very close. My 12 years of experience as a bank employee turned out to be completely useless in a small, forgotten town like ours. No one here was looking for experience, responsibility, or long resumes. They wanted someone younger, cheaper, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions or expect stability. Every interview ended the same way: a sympathetic look, a polite smile, and a sentence that made something inside me quietly crumble, like old plaster falling off a wall. Money was disappearing fast. Not in some abstract way, but in the most humiliating, practical sense. I knew the exact amount left in my account at all times. I knew how many days it had to last. I constantly chose what could be paid this month and what would have to wait. At night, I sometimes caught myself counting money in my head, money I didn't even have. Every once in a while, despair would hit without warning. It came like a wave and pulled me under so completely that I could barely breathe. In those moments, the air itself felt thick, heavy, like moving through water. And then spring arrived. The season I hated the most. Spring in our town was never about renewal. It was about dirty, melting snow. About grey slush and puddles with rainbow-colored oil floating on top. About trash surfacing from under the snow, like the city was finally revealing everything it had been hiding all winter. The grey blanket of depression didn't lift, it just changed color. It turned brown, wet, and sticky. And yet, life went on. People rushed somewhere, laughed, argued, made plans. The city kept moving as if my personal collapse didn't exist at all. Around that time, our property management company decided it was the perfect moment to refresh the building. They slapped filler into the cracks between the concrete panels and painted the entire facade a cheerful pink. The color felt painfully out of place, almost mocking. Construction platforms appeared outside the building, swaying slightly in the wind like empty cocoons. Down in the courtyard, they parked a small trailer for the workers, grey, beaten up, with cloudy windows. It sat directly below my apartment, right in my line of sight. One day, after yet another interview, I came home completely drained. That time, they politely explained that at 35, I was a little too old for a pension services specialist position. They said it gently, almost kindly, as if my age wasn't a fact, but a personal flaw. I walked into the kitchen, shook the last bits of coffee grounds from a jar into my favorite mug, and poured hot water over them. The coffee came out weak and nearly transparent, but it was all I had. I opened the window, and damp air rushed in, carrying the smell of dust and fresh paint. I climbed onto the windowsill and let my legs hang outside. My mind felt empty, not calm, just exhausted. Thoughts didn't fully form anymore. They drifted in and out in fragments. Somewhere in the background, small, ordinary worries kept spinning. My daughter needed white socks for her kindergarten performance. The screen in the kitchen had finally broken. I'd have to call a repairman. And after that, there would be almost no money left. Those thoughts didn't scare me. They just pressed down on me. Slowly. Constantly. And then, suddenly, a voice spoke right nearby. "So, what are we doing just sitting here?" I flinched so hard my heart slammed into my ribs. The mug slipped in my hand, and I almost dropped it out the window. I knew for a fact that a second earlier, no one had been there. It was the 4th floor, just to be clear. And there were no neighboring balconies anywhere near my window. I leaned out a little farther, my heart still racing, and that's when I saw him right outside my window. A guy was sitting on a narrow suspended platform, the kind that hung from thick ropes lowered from the roof. The platform swayed slightly as he shifted his weight. In his hands were tools and a can of expanding foam, the kind construction workers use to seal cracks. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then he looked up. He smiled at me, not awkwardly, not nervously, but with an open, almost disarmingly warm smile. The kind you don't expect from a stranger dangling 4 stories above the ground. "Julie," he said casually, like we already knew each other. "You're not thinking about jumping, Are you? My face instantly burned. I was embarrassed and scared by the fact that this was the conclusion he jumped to. The idea that I could look like someone standing on the edge shook me more than I wanted to admit. Without thinking, just to break the tension, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Would you like some coffee? The words hung in the air for a second. Then his smile widened. Sure, he said. Why not? Before I could even question what was happening, he expertly climbed from the suspended platform onto my windowsill. He moved with practiced ease, like this was nothing unusual. He unhooked a few safety lines, set his tool bag down on the floor, and pulled up a small folding stool, sitting at my kitchen table as if he'd been there 100 times before. I stood there frozen, watching it all like it was happening to someone else. And then it hit me. The coffee. I suddenly remembered that what I'd poured earlier was the absolute last of it. No backup. No extra jar hidden in the cupboard. I cleared my throat and awkwardly admitted it. So, full disclosure, I said, gesturing weakly toward the mug. That was actually my last coffee. For a second, we just stared at each other. And then we both started laughing. Real laughter. The kind that surprises you because you'd forgotten how it feels. My name's Peter, he said once the laughter died down. And tea works just fine. I put the kettle on, still slightly dazed, still half convinced this was some strange hallucination brought on by exhaustion and caffeine deprivation. He sat there calmly, looking around my tiny kitchen, the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, the quiet signs of a life stretched thin. Somehow, without effort, we started talking. About nothing and everything at the same time. About work. About the weather. About how spring in small towns always looked worse before it looked better. About random, meaningless things that didn't require explanations or apologies. And for the first time in a long while, the silence in my apartment didn't feel heavy. It felt human. I started talking, slowly at first, then faster, like something inside me had finally cracked open. I told him about the job search, about how there were no real offers, just endless rejections. About how money was tight all the time, how every day felt like juggling bills and urgent little problems that never ended. Somewhere in the middle of it, I mentioned the apartment, how the kitchen faucet had been leaking for weeks, dripping all night and driving me insane, but I kept putting off calling a plumber. Peter listened. Really listened. He didn't interrupt or throw out empty advice. He just nodded and asked simple, human questions, the kind no one had asked me in a long time. Then he told me about himself. He said he'd always been into climbing, and eventually it turned into a job. Industrial climbing. Dangerous work, but it paid well if you knew what you were doing and weren't afraid of heights. That's how he made a living, moving from site to site, taking whatever contracts came up. He lived out in the suburbs. He had a family, a wife and a little son. He said it calmly, without drama, but there was a tired note in his voice. He didn't see them as often as he wanted to because he was always working. But when I am home, he added with a small smile, I really try to be there. When we finished our tea, Peter suddenly opened his tool bag, pulled something out, and walked over to the sink like it was the most natural thing in the world. I protested immediately, told him I'd call a plumber, said it was awkward, that I couldn't accept it, that I had no way to thank him for the help. He waved it off like it was nothing. Relax, he said. It'll take 5 minutes. And it did. A few confident movements, a quiet metallic click, and the faucet stopped dripping. Completely. The sudden silence in the kitchen felt almost unreal. Peter wiped his hands, packed up his tools, and said he should get going. His co-workers were probably already looking for him. Standing in the doorway, he turned back to me. Don't be sad, Julie, he said gently. Things are going to get better. Then, with a half smile, he added, when you come visit me sometime, that's when we'll finally have coffee. The real kind. I closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment. Then I walked over to the sink and started washing the cups, slow and absent-minded. And suddenly, a thought hit me so hard it felt like ice water down my spine. How did he know my name? I froze, still holding a cup in my hand. I replayed the whole scene in my head. From the very beginning. When he'd asked if I was thinking about jumping, I hadn't introduced myself. I hadn't told him anything. The thought hung there. Strange. Unsettling. But there was no time to dwell on it. I had to run and pick up my daughter from daycare. Real life, as always, pushed everything else aside. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door. And yet, my life really did start to turn around after that unexpected visit. At first, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it never went back the way it was before. At first, it happened in small, almost cautious steps. One day, an old friend from work called me out of the blue. She asked, half casually, whether I'd managed to find a job yet. When I said no, she hesitated for a second and then told me that a position had just opened up in her department, a specialist role, stable, with a salary that was actually considered good for a town like ours. For the first time in a long while, my chest felt lighter. Not long after that, my ex-husband suddenly resurfaced. After months of silence, excuses, and avoidance, he reached out and said he wanted to settle the back child support he owed for our daughter. No drama. No arguments. Just money transferred into my account. I stared at the screen in disbelief for a long time. Little by little, my life began to straighten itself out. Not magically, not overnight, but steadily enough that I started to believe again. I slept better. I worried less. I even caught myself making plans instead of just reacting to emergencies. About a month later, I was walking home and noticed that the renovation on our building was almost finished. The bright pink paint had dried, the cracks were sealed, and the construction platforms were being dismantled one by one. And that's when I thought of Peter. It suddenly felt wrong not to thank him properly, not just for fixing the faucet, but for showing up at exactly the moment when I needed it most. For the quiet support he'd given without even realizing how much it mattered. I stopped by a nearby store and bought a jar of good coffee. The real kind. I also grabbed some snacks, cookies, chocolates, whatever looked decent, and headed toward the workers' trailer in the courtyard. Outside the trailer, two guys were sitting on a bench, smoking and scrolling through their phones. I asked them if they knew where I could find Peter, the climber who'd been working on the building. They exchanged surprised looks. Peter, one of them repeated. Then they shook their heads. They said they were new. Had just joined the crew recently. They suggested I talk to the foreman instead and pointed toward the trailer door. For some reason, a strange, quiet unease crept up my spine. But I pushed it aside and walked closer. I found the foreman out in the courtyard, near the building, checking something on his clipboard. I asked him the same question, whether he knew where I could find Peter, the climber who'd been working on the facade. He froze. Not for long, just a second, but long enough for me to notice. Then he looked at me carefully, like he was trying to place my face in a memory that didn't quite fit. Peter, he repeated slowly. Then, after a pause, he asked, almost cautiously, "And, who are you to Peter?" The question threw me off. I stumbled through my explanation, told him about the day we met, about the window, the tea, the faucet he'd fixed. About how he'd helped me when I was having a really hard time. The foreman didn't interrupt. His expression changed as I spoke, confusion giving way to something heavier. Finally, he cleared his throat and nodded toward the workers' trailer. "Come inside," he said quietly. "You should probably sit down." Inside the trailer, the air smelled like dust, old coffee, and cigarette smoke. I sat down on a battered metal chair that wobbled slightly under my weight. The foreman leaned against the counter for a moment, like he needed to steady himself too. Then he told me the truth. Peter had worked on his crew more than 6 months ago. He'd been a solid worker. Reliable. A genuinely good guy, the kind everyone liked having around. But one night, after finishing a side job, Peter was heading home to his family. He'd just gotten paid in cash. He never made it. They found him outside the city, dumped on the side of the road. He'd been thrown from a car. Severe head trauma. No identification on him by the time someone finally stopped and called it in. Peter died in the ICU without ever regaining consciousness. The foreman said the taxi driver was caught later. Charged. Sentenced. The case was closed. Life moved on for everyone except the people who remembered him. I sat there on that old chair, staring at the floor, completely unable to speak. Less than a month ago, I had been drinking tea with him in my kitchen. He'd laughed. He'd talked about his family. He'd fixed my faucet. The faucet that was still working perfectly to this day. My mind refused to accept it. It kept searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, another Peter. Anyone but the man who had sat at my table and told me not to be sad. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no sound came out. Because suddenly, every small detail I had brushed aside came rushing back at once. How he knew my name. How easily he'd stepped into my apartment. How he'd appeared exactly when I was sitting on the windowsill, exhausted and hollowed out. How my life had started getting better almost immediately after he left. The trailer felt too quiet, too still. I realized my hands were shaking. And for the first time since that day at the window, I wondered, not gently, not abstractly, but seriously. Who had I really invited into my home? I found Peter's family address a few days later. And closer to summer, when the trees were already covered in soft, new leaves and the air finally stopped feeling so heavy, I drove out to the suburbs. They lived in a small, modest house. Nothing fancy. A neat yard, children's toys near the porch. The kind of place that felt lived in, even through grief. Peter's mother lived there. So did his wife and their little son. Her name was Julie too. That detail hit me harder than I expected. She listened to my story in silence. Didn't interrupt. Didn't question it. She just sat there, slowly wiping tears from her face with the edge of her sleeve, like she was afraid that if she stopped, they would never stop coming. When I finished, she nodded quietly. Neither of us tried to explain anything. She poured coffee into a thermos, strong, real coffee, and without saying much, we walked together to visit Peter. The cemetery was calm, peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and birds were loud in that careless way they always are, no matter what humans are carrying inside. From the stone monument, a familiar face looked back at us. That same open smile. That same slight squint in his eyes, like he was always amused by something just beyond view. For a moment, it felt almost unreal. Like if I blinked, he'd step down from the stone and casually ask why we were standing there so quietly. Everything that he told me then came true, everything in my life got better, and I came to visit him to drink coffee.